not only the Center for American Studies and Research, but also the Department of English and the Department of the program in creative writing in the Department of English are all co-sponsoring today's talk, which is by Duriel E. Harris, and it's entitled Sounding the Critical Black Body Towards the Poetics of Performance. Before I tell you about Professor Harris's work, I'd like to remind you that there will be a performance by her at Babel Theater, which is near AUH in the former Marignane Cinema. It's 8 p.m. On Saturday night, the day after tomorrow, and it's 20,000 Lebanese lira and 10 for students. So I hope you can come to that piece, which is entitled Performing Witness. Today's lecture is entitled Sounding the Critical Black Body Towards the Poetics of Performance. Professor Harris is heralded by WBEZ Chicago Public Radio as one of the 3 poets for the 21st century. She's the author of the sound recording PRDGM and 2 books of poetry, one entitled Drag by Elixir Press, and the other Amnesiac Poems, which is forthcoming from Sheep Meadow Press. She's not only an acclaimed poet and performance sound artist, she's a scholar and holds degrees from Yale University, the graduate creative writing program at NYU, and she also holds a PhD from the University of Illinois. She's been awarded grants from the Illinois Arts Council and postdoctoral residencies at the University of Illinois Chicago and the University of California, Santa Barbara. Her current work on Amnesiac also is the title of the project, which is a media art project, is funded in part by the University of California, Santa Barbara Center for Black Studies, Race and Technology Initiative. Sterling Plump has described her work as, quote, a 21st century literary text emerging out of the prism of race, gender, and social class. It is eloquently postmodern funk and intimately original. In addition to performing her work in cities across the U.S., Harris is also an assistant professor of English and teaches creative writing and poetics at Illinois State University. Again, she's going to be talking to us to some extent about the tradition of what she does and helping to provide background for those of us who will and won't be able to come on Saturday night. I really hope you can come and see her performance on Saturday night. We're so happy to have her here today. Welcome.
Good evening. Guess I'll sit.
There's a wireless microphone.
Oh, wireless mics. We just don't get along. Wireless mic and I have microphone issues. I want to thank you all very much for coming. I want to thank Robert for that very generous introduction, and I want to thank him as well, very officially, as the, did you say the interim?
We never know, life's short.
Director of the Center for American Studies and Research, as well as the Dean's Office, the Department of English, and the Creative Writing Program, and their respective staff and faculty for welcoming me here to Lebanon and affording me the opportunity to share my work with you here at American University of Beirut. And I would especially like to thank all of you for the gift of your presence here this evening and your focused attention. Before we begin, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about my work and some of my current preoccupations in order to better situate some of what I'm going to say today and our subsequent discussion. I'm hoping that we will have some time for discussion together after I give some of my comments. So I am a native of Chicago, Illinois, which is known as the hub of the American Midwest. As an undergraduate, as Robert mentioned, I studied at Yale. I studied literature and literary theory there. And in the graduate creative writing program at New York University in New York City, I focused on poetry and English and American literature. Finally, I studied poetry, specializing in African American literature at the University of Illinois at Chicago, where I earned the PhD with a creative dissertation from the UIC program for writers. And so my dissertation became my first book, Drag, which was put out by Elixir Press. My scholarship and research interests include improvisation and Black aesthetics, memory and trauma studies, women of color feminisms, digital technologies in the African diaspora, 18th and 19th century African American literature, and oppositional and experimental poetics. I teach poetry and poetics as well as African American literature as a faculty member of the Graduate Creative Writing Program at Illinois State University. This is my first semester there, or I just finished my first semester there, so yes, in Bloomington Normal in central Illinois. I'm also a poet and performer, and I do hope to see you on Saturday. And some of my recent solo readings and performances include performances at the Visiting Authors Reader Series, the Downtown Writers Center in Syracuse, New York, Poets Out Loud at Lincoln Center in New York City, and a reading sponsored by the Poetry Center in San Francisco. I work with sound and electronic music on my own, and I do some multi-genre performances using original tracks and vocal effects processing. The ongoing project that I'm working on is a multimedia project, and it's called Amnesiac, and the book of poems that Robert mentioned, which is forthcoming from Sheet Metal Press, is one part of it. Also part of that larger work is a DVD, a website, and a sound recording, and so I'm working on those additional aspects of the project now, and have been particularly influenced in the desired shape of the project by some recent findings in cognitive neuroscience that I'll mention somewhat briefly today, and that I'm not going to say that it's quite thrown a wrench in the work that I've been doing, but it's definitely changed some of the ways in which I've been thinking about still and moving image as well as utterance. I'm also a part of a collective called Black Took Collective, which I co-founded in 1999 with Dawn Lundy Martin and Ronaldo Lee Wilson. And we co-founded that at Cave Canem, which is a retreat for African American poets, which was founded in 1996 by the poets Toy Derricott and Cornelius Eady. And we call ourselves a group of Black post-theorists. At one point we called ourselves young, but I suppose we're not quite as young as we had been, so now we're perhaps younger, as the rain will attest to. And we write and perform in hybrid experimental forms, and we embrace radical poetics, and as much as we can, embrace cutting-edge critical theory about race, gender, and sexuality. We have a manifesto that was published in the magazine Defense and is republished in a Best Defense anthology the first 9 years. And in that, our manifesto is called A Call for Dissidence. I'm particularly interested in an interrogation of the narrative of Black poem and more kind of conventional senses of Black poetics to move toward oppositional and experimentation, oppositional poetics and experimentation as a means by which to really open up spaces for new ways of thinking about selves and new ways of being in bodies. I'm also a member of a 9-piece improvisational free jazz ensemble called Douglas Ewart and Inventions. And we gig regularly at a place called the Velvet Lounge in Chicago's South Loop. And there I vocalize and perform poetry and play percussive accents. And we have a new CD out called Velvet Fire. It was just released this week. So we had a gig on Sunday, and the CD was out and hot off the press. The CD will be available for purchase at my performance at the Babel Theater on Saturday. And I hope that everybody can make it. If you can't make it, tell other people to make it and pick up a CD. I'm also an editor at work with scholar Michael Antonucci, who teaches in Vermont at Keene State College, on a book called Chance Commands, an anthology of essays in conversation with the poetry of Sterling Plumb, a blues jazz poet based in Chicago. Now, as you may know, Chicago is the home of experimental and improvisational jazz, represented in part by the work of the Association for the Advancement of Creative Musicians, the AACM, of which my band is a part, the famed Art Ensemble of Chicago, and Von Freeman, among other jazz greats. You may also know that Chicago claims its fame as the Northern American home of the blues and originally Southern African American musical tradition. As the final stop on the Illinois Central Railroad line and a city of relative opportunity, in the early and mid-20th century, Chicago was touted as the northern promised land to African Americans fleeing poverty, persecution, Jim Crow segregation, and disenfranchisement in the American South. Chicago, therefore, became a major destination for blacks migrating from Mississippi and Alabama and other states in the Deep South. For many black Chicagoans, myself and my family included, there is Sweet Home Chicago and Down Home, or the South, to which ties are still maintained and cultivated. So to give you a little bit of context, a few notes on blues and jazz. Rooted in the American South and its northern satellite of Chicago, blues and jazz are America's fundamental original music and expressive artist traditions, created and sustained by African American artistry. Blues and jazz are extensions of the same impulse. Jazz practitioners of note, from Duke Ellington to Louis Armstrong to Dizzy Gillespie, Miles Davis, Charles Mingus, Charlie Parker, Eric Dolphy, and Von Freeman all acknowledge blues as jazz's core and foundation. In his seminal work, Stomping the Blues, renowned scholar Albert Murray goes so far as to completely disregard the distinction between blues and jazz altogether. So to the extent that jazz has blues roots and African American music is part of a rich tradition of African American expressive arts, I will speak of these musical genres and their corresponding forms in poetry, dance, visual, and performing arts as the blues-jazz continuum. Notably, African American expressive arts and cultural practices have traditionally functioned as ritual intervention. Embodying strategies of resistance, such intervention enabled the survival and prosperity of various communities of black peoples in an oppressive, white supremacist, patriarchal, capitalist republic, the United States of America, a republic with a long and vigorous history of state-sanctioned violence and suppression. In his seminal essay, Performance Studies, Interventions, and Radical Research, Dwight Conquergood offers a useful frame through which to consider the coded complexity of blues jazz performance, juxtaposing embodied knowledge to dominant ways of knowing, Conquer uses Foucault's notion of subjugated knowledges to help codify readers' and hearers' understanding. Conquer writes, Michel Foucault coined the term subjugated knowledges to include all the local, regional, vernacular, naive knowledges at the bottom of the hierarchy, the low other of science. These are the non-serious ways of knowing that dominant culture neglects, excludes, represses, or simply fails to recognize. Subjugated knowledges have been erased because they are illegible. They exist by and large as active bodies of meaning outside of books, eluding the forces of inscription that would make them legible and thereby legitimate. He continues, what gets squeezed out by this epistemic violence is the whole realm of complex, finely nuanced meaning that is embodied, tacit, intoned, gestured, improvised, co-experienced, covert, all the more deeply meaningful because of its refusal to be spelled out. Dominant epistemologies that link knowing with seeing are not attuned to meanings that are masked, camouflaged, indirect, embedded, or hidden in context. The visual, verbal basis and bias of Western regimes of knowledge blinds researchers to meanings that are expressed forcefully through intonation, silence, body tension, arched eyebrows, blank stares, and other protective arts of disguise and secrecy, what Desserteau calls the elocutionary experience of a fugitive communication. Subordinate people do not have the privilege of explicitness, the luxury of transparency, the presumptive norm of clear and direct communication, free and open debate on a level playing field that privileged classes take for granted. Now, attending to the blues jazz continuum and blues culture, we attend to the world of a subordinate people and an embodied, subjugated knowledge articulated by performance. Now I'm going to issue a crucial premise. The binary mind-body dichotomy that pervades Western thinking is an instrument of dominant discourse. Firmly installed and institutionalized, this binary assists in the effective policing and control of human bodies. So firmly is it installed that its displacement mandates a radical shift. Overcoming the body-mind distinction requires understanding the human body as consciousness in itself, and requires accepting the notion that the mind exists throughout the body. For as Merleau-Ponty instructs, the body is not an instrument of the mind, nor is it connected to it. It is not a vehicle for directed sensation. I am not in front of my body. I am in it, or rather, I am it. Even as we categorize experience in order to facilitate the discussion of different levels of awareness, citing the local self, the self that experiences sensation, and the transcendental self, the self that perceives or watches experience, there is no inner self that exists apart from the body. Following this reasoning, any legitimate attention to consciousness by necessity attends to the entirety of the self being, what we will simply refer to today as the body. The fundamental engaged mental state characterized by active questioning and acknowledged agency, conceptualized by Paulo Freire as critical consciousness, can then for our purposes be called the critical body. Black bodies, diasporic African bodies, and to an even greater degree, critical black bodies, have long been sites of contestation and loci of social control, subject to sale, inhumane conditions, multiple invasions, and strenuous labor as chattel, exploited, disenfranchised, imprisoned, lynched, and dismembered as free citizens, legislated against, mocked and derided, pathologized, sexualized, and criminalized. Critical black bodies are a favorite target, designated deviant, occupying the beloved space of radical otherness in white supremacist hegemonic discourse. Interactions between and among people can be understood via the lens of relative power, and as such, individual and institutional power functions in conjunction with or in the service of hegemony. For purposes of the analysis of relations between and among people, power can be usefully categorized in terms of its physical, cultural, and psychological aspects, and resistance to hegemony is similarly articulated in physical, cultural, and psychological terms. Considering Gramsci's elaboration of hegemony as roughly a whole range of practical strategies by which a dominant power elicits consent to its rule from those it subjugates, and the looming and pervasive presence of domination, the power of the state to discipline and punish, culturally relevant expressive arts should concern themselves with that which proffers dissent and spurs critical consciousness, critical bodies. Responding to these constant threats against black bodies, black expressive arts, like those of the blues-jazz continuum, seek to counter practical strategies of subjugation by innovative means. Now, in speaking of the blues, you may have been privy or witness to a common conflation. When asked by researchers to define the blues players such as Muddy Waters, Big Mama Thornton, Howlin' Wolf, Barry Lewis have variously characterized blues as trouble, want, worry, vexation, unfulfilled and unfillable longing, a deep sadness resonating in the bones, a feeling. And yet blues, as we will speak of it today, is not trouble, not worry or vexation, but rather the antidote to that deep and resonating feeling, an expressive mode originating from the drive towards renewal. Blues expression is employed to alleviate, to drive away, or as Albert Murray reflects, to stomp blues feeling. Now, you may have also heard blues linked with evil, trickery, and witchcraft. Blues does have a long and complex association with evil. Significantly, as scholars note and have argued persuasively, we often term evil that which is different or challenging, that which we perceive as threatening to the established order, or heralding the advent of the new and perhaps outlandish. Though not addressed directly during my talk today, much of blues symbology and lyrical references to trickster figures and witchcraft serve as evidence of African cultural survivals and indicate the breadth of the blues-jazz continuum. Moreover, the association with evil serves to further indicate blues' potential subversive force. During part of our remaining time today, I will offer reflections upon my engagement with the work of the poet Sterling D. Plump, sounding his work and my ruminations upon his work as a way to approach developing notions of a poetics of performance. Now, I have to say, my notions of poetics of performance are definitely in developmental stages. I've really been doing a lot of thinking and rethinking, in part because of some of the work that I'm doing for Amnesiac is the idea of presenting a poetry video, and so I started to do more research about videography and combining that with the information that I've gotten from cognitive neuroscience about still and moving image and thinking about the human mirror neuron system and how we read what it is that we see and how we understand language that is spoken. Putting all of this together, I've got a lot that I'm still thinking about, and I'm not a cognitive neuroscientist, so it's taking me, a little bit to put it together and bringing these different disciplines together, so bear with me. But we'll start with the work of Sterling Plump and move in that direction in the time that we have remaining. Sounding the critical black body towards the poetics of performance. I first encountered Sterling Plump early in my doctoral career at the University of Illinois in Chicago. At that time, he was a professor of English and African American Studies and the author of 12 books, including Black Rituals, a biography, Somehow We Survive, an edited anthology of South African writing, and 10 collections of poetry, including Half Black, Half Blacker, The Mojo Hands Call I Must Go, Blues, The Story Always Untold, Horn Man, and Ornate with Smoke. Since then, he's published 2 additional volumes of poems, Blues Narratives, and Velvet Bebop Kente Cloth. And with his retirement, he's focused primarily upon the completion and revision of his epic work in progress, Mafua's Song, excerpts of which we'll briefly examine today. Now, Blues Narratives is also actually an excerpt of this longer volume, Mafua's Song, in progress. He's garnered numerous awards for his poetry, including the Carl Sandburg Literary Award, the Richard Wright Literary Excellence Award, and the Mississippi Valley Blues Society River Road Lifetime Achievement Award. He's also had several songs recorded by blues great Willie Kent, including 911 and Lonely Streets, and his poem My Feeling Tone serves as libretto for the renowned Swiss composer George Gruntz's Chicago Cantata. Even with all of those honors, Sterling Plump is relatively a well-kept secret. In part, it might have something to do with the fact that he works in this blues jazz idiom. Now, since our first encounters, I've come to know Sterling Plump as a dynamic poet, teacher, a scholar, and a master of the quintessential American idiom of blues and jazz, and such that, in good company, I've joined some other collaborators and colleagues to turn our scholarly eyes toward his intellectual and artistic development, his poetics, and the distinctive character of his presence in African and African American diasporic letters and expressive art. So to that end, my colleague Michael Antonucci and I co-edited a special section of the Arkansas Review dedicated to Plump's work, and we participated in some different social and intellectual gatherings, including panel discussions, for example, the 2006 Delta Blues Symposium in Jonesboro, Arkansas, and the Modern Language Association Convention in 2007. Most recently, I was asked to co-edit the journal, an issue of the journal Mississippi Valley Voices, an issue dedicated to the work of Sterling Plump. And in that issue, that was published this past summer, we were working to expand the field of discourse generated by our previous gatherings and publications, and to bring some of that work to fuel the momentum for the book Chance Commands Conversations with Sterling Plump, a nonfiction book project that was initially conceived with Michael Antonucci during our time at the University of Illinois. Now, my various critical and creative scholarly engagements with Sterling Plump and his poetry have been, for me, very provocative and productive. My thinking, writing, and performance have been particularly informed by my role as an editor. Now, approaching the work of Sterling Plump I've been invigorated by his dedication to and his increasing achievement of oppositional mastery. The mastery of this blatantly unapologetic living blues jazz idiom. In line with Erica Hunt's theorizing in Notes for an Oppositional Poetics, the blues jazz idiom is not only a particular style or aesthetic, but also, and most significantly, an oppositional strategy of articulation that accesses the subversive potential of formal experiment. Choosing this mode, Sterling Plump champions the subaltern and asserts the legitimacy of what Delta scholar Clyde Woods calls the blues epistemology, enacting a refusal of the primacy of the dominant order. In so doing, Plump privileges a distinct and unwieldy otherness, that which has been and continues to be marginalized, demonized, obscured, co-opted, and wished dead by dominant discourse. Via his own aesthetic, marked by the innovative use of characteristic blues elements such as indirection, signifying, and his particular use of a short, emphatic line, fragmented thoughts, the virtual staccato breath, polyphony, call and response, metaphor, allusion, pun, and anaphora. Plump works to resist the principle of co-optation, according to which opposition is alternately demonized or accommodated. Electing to engage his literary inheritance via the living blues jazz idiom, Sterling Plump animates what Stephen Henderson calls the moral impact of black presence and speaks a long-standing, troubling truth to power. Now for a little conjure. In case you're not quite as familiar with blues. Blues, the power of the word, the sign in, against, through system of signs, dance, drum, song that creates the mood and what you sing to get there. Indirection, humor, irony, play, trickster, mask, and metamasking, improvisational transgression. The blues, a healing, everyday longing to night resistance and counter agent, oppositional form and content encoded, heroic self-assertion facing social and material death, the gut and grit of struggle, earthy ambivalence, grounded radical pleasure of being in spite of trouble, in spite of worry, worrying the line, vexation, crossroads, shift. What Paul Guerin calls the embodiment of true poetic spirit, blues, the spirit of revolt, unmanageable excess, wild core of the docile body, Slim Greer, that's Langston Hughes, Slim Greer, Slim in Atlanta, Slim in hell, field holla call, field holla response, backwater, viola, levee, roll, ride, and boxcars, birthing the mothership, how you sound, how you hear, how you sense and know. Slick City, Delta Swamp, distinctive and dominant source from which springs outlandish renewal, signifying. In Development Arrested, Clyde Woods offers this frame. The blues courageously explores the origins, varieties, and consequences of life lived in a brutal and loveless society. It is also the voice of those who are dedicated to the preservation of their humanity. The blues is a vision of a society that is dialectically polyrhythmic, a democracy where both cooperation and individual expression thrive. In the creation of Mafua's song, an epic blues, and his most ambitious to date, Sterling Plump extends the work of his previous volumes to engage the entirety of blues as vision and mindful impulse, to fully access its generative model. While conventionally lyric, blues is inclined to myth, and in Plump's capable hands fully lends itself to epic. Now, commenting on the title and conceptual anchors of his epic, in a recent interview, Sterling Plump reveals Mafua is the name I gave to the mother of the oldest known relative in my family, Temper, who I am told was born in 1772 and died in 1903. I am sure she was from West Africa, and for some reason I thought Temper's mother would be Mafua. The long work, Mafua's Song, is based upon my entire family's ancestry. Beginning in medias res, in transit in the hold of a slave ship, and carrying us to the contemporary moment, the loose chronology of Mafua's Song fills countless pages, early drafts numbered as many as 500 pages. It has progressed through various stages in its plentiful drafts and has been more than 25 years in the making. Attending to Mafua's Song, Plump has remained deeply engaged in the world of blues and blues people, a world, as Plump describes it, populated by characters who are articulate but not literate. In this way, Plump's project is one of translation and transliteration, bringing to literary language the subjugated knowledge of a subordinate people. With this information in mind, I'd like to make several brief statements regarding the manner of the performative work of the initial sections of World as a Witness, Something Gone, and Mafua's Song in general. Now you have with you, I think before you, a little piece of World as a Witness, Something Gone that I am going to refer to, and you also have, and you should have a copy of James Weldon Johnson's creation, to which World as a Witness, Something Gone refers. Okay. So first we'll be looking at the James Weldon Johnson, then we'll move to the Plump. Alluding most explicitly to the first verses of Genesis, which I think we might be familiar with. In the beginning, oh goodness, in the beginning, no, that's not that. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was without form and void, and darkness moved upon the face of the earth, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. So we have the first verses of Genesis and the familiar, which is the first verses of Genesis, which are the familiar Judeo-Christian account of the beginnings of the universe, and James Weldon Johnson's famous early 20th century sermonic revision of that account. Alluding to those, Plump creates the space of a witnessing world as he proclaims its existence. Now, the first few stanzas of Johnson's creation read, and I'm going to sermonically give it to you. You may read along. And God stepped out on space, and he looked around and said, I'm lonely. I'll make me a world. And as far as the eye of God could see, darkness covered everything, blacker than 100 midnights down in a cypress swamp. Then God smiled, and the light broke, and the darkness rolled up on one side, and the light stood shining on the other. And God said, that's good. Then God reached out and took the light in his hands, and God rolled the light around in his hands until he made the sun. And he set that sun ablazing in the heavens. And the light that was left from making the sun, God gathered it up in a shining ball and flung it out against the darkness, spangling the night with the moon and stars. Then down between the darkness and the light, he hurled the world. In a troubling revision, documenting another Genesis, Plump's Mafua's Song begins in transit in the slave ship's hold. The first three sections from Book 1, Part 1, World as a Witness, Something Gone, offer a poignant secular sermon, and the blues is known as the secular kind of sermon, secular gospel. Dark, dark within winter's lashing, dark, dark within journeys rollicking, dark, dark within air bleeding, dark within skin, remembering, dark within chains, lashing, within breaths ebbing, within tongues forgetting, bodies distilling, in the whole. I got a song, I got a song, I got a song. Lord, I got a song. Mama always say, long ways, long ways, long ways. Where folded sheets of memory sleep, I wake them in callings. Before shackles teach me distances from my familiar place. I was a child of arms, a land holding its kin. I was calabash, rebirth of fruits in seasons after droughts, rivers of memory gathered, compressed for storage. There are borders, there are borders, there are borders. Between the vine, singing in rhythm with the circle and fruit wandering, the child must wander, let its vines uncoil for dreams. History, a woman's concern, mending, cleaning, knitting a few things for hard times. My soul is a witness, something gone. My soul is a witness, something gone. Compounding the biblical word. And Johnson's reworded sermonic oration, Plump's phrasing is metalinguistic. The world is multiple, constituted by physical and psychic space, communities, histories, traditions, inheritances, sensation, and as it is perceived by the senses. More specifically, as both noun and adjective, Plump's dark is doubly so, as it signifies an absence that absorbs more light than it reflects. It is at once a dark location and a dark condition of mind that threatens to take and ruin, a troubling, dense with winters, journeys, air, and skin, such that its depth and breadth, its volume, has weight. In the early lines of the poem, this weight is not necessarily perceivable as burden, but via anaphora, repetition, and caesura, the pauses, it augments. As we move through the stanza, its oppressive quality becomes so pronounced that it, what is by definition indistinct and indiscernible, dark, emerges as palpable. Significantly, this location serves as a birthing place for the world of both the individual and the collective body. In Blues, The Conflict of Cultures, Jen Hines-John writes, the blues singer does not in fact express his personal experiences and transfer them to his audience. On the contrary, it is the experiences of the community that he is expressing, making himself its spokesman. Even when there is talk of loneliness, of the beloved who has run away, of the neglected wife, of nostalgia for the South, it is not the personal experience that is emphasized, but the typical experience of all those rejected by society. Maximizing the ways in which the lyric I in blues idiom traditionally represents the individual and the collective, Plump complicates the dominant individualist notions of the autobiographical project to position audience members to reconsider the character and grounding of the African American Black collective consciousness. As spokesman, Plump's speaker retells the African American originary experience, the collective primal scene, as that of palpable darkness, a complex image used to represent the massive devastation and social death, the trauma of Middle Passage. The Middle Passage, the arduous intermediary phase of the Atlantic slave trade, during which Africans were transported to the New World of the Americas. Kidnapped from their villages and sold or dragged into bondage, Africans from Angola, the Gold Coast, Biafra, Senegambia, etc., who would eventually arrive at the vast plantations of colonies in the Caribbean and the somewhat smaller decentralized plantations in the colonies and subsequent slaveholding states of the American South, had to survive the journey. Conditions in the hold in the belly of slave ships were less than hospitable. As an understatement, raped and beaten, stacked and shackled in metal cages with little room to breathe or move, African men, women, and children of various language and ethnic groups were accompanied by death and disease, traveling in darkness for weeks at a time in the filth and stench of waste and vomit to arrive in the clutches of a life of degradation as chattel in the peculiar institution of American slavery. Yet even within, against, and possessed by darkness, the epic voice, girded by the wisdom of antecedents, enacts truths by illuminating borders, shaping the name of the absent thing without naming it, something gone. Demonstrating that you need not know the name of a thing to know it, Plump disrupts dominant paradigms of knowing, displacing the dominant worldview in favor of the blues epistemology, an embodied epistemology. The impalpable soul bears witness to material conditions, the abstract concretely manifest and intuited by the critical body. In Plump's Mafua's song, these and other details of the specific considered lives, the life of Mafua and her speaking descendants, are crafted to illuminate human resilience. For the whole does not silence the speaking voice, does not diminish utterance. Framed in the specific social historical moment, and always already contemporary moment, the anaphora, I got a song, I got a song, I got a song, operates to emphasize the speaker's survival in the face of trauma and the enduring presence of subjectivity through expression. Further, when recognized as a configuration of collective experience, its utterance enacts a performative, affirming the survival of the family lineage and a community of oppressed people, blues people, and speaks their song into being. Moreover, in Mafua's song, accounting is revealed to be the very seed of wandering. In this way, Plump turns our attention to the migrant impulse, the crafted articulations of the critical, critically conscious, Black diasporic African migrant body in response to a pervasive atmosphere of hostility and duress. As assertive agent, the critical Black body assesses possibility and decides to relinquish the familiar territory of the birthland on the African continent, in the American South, in the Northern American city, etc., and move, holding home within the body, prizing mobility rather than internalizing the mark of dispossession. In Land of Hope, Chicago, Black Southerners and the Great Migration, James Grossman writes, a migrant's decision to act could be taken as a challenge, an aggressive statement of dissatisfaction. Such autonomy and ambition constituted a direct threat to the fiber of social and economic relations in the South. Public values rested upon the assumption that Blacks were by nature docile, dependent, and unambitious, even if the system itself depended on repressive devices to ensure that facility. The Great Migration, post-World War II, represented a refusal by 500,000 Black Southerners to cooperate. Dissatisfaction and aggression were characteristics that most white Southerners preferred not to associate with their Negroes. Migration, a critical body self-assertion in the face of dissatisfaction, marks the exercise of freedom as embodied knowledge. Through a distinctive organic form, Mafua's song explores the devastation of an embattled present forced to engage the field of existence across time. Plump's lyrical cartography captures blues' interior terrain, drawing on African American and diasporic African expressive traditions to render defiant lamentations, sagacious observations, and itinerant assessments of a world rife with trauma. Plump's epic voice confronts the awful maw of history, the glowering darkness of a modern world marked by ruin, world is a witness, testament to the extremity endured by black folk, blues people, since the world was hurled down between darkness and light, since blues began to take shape. In so doing, the speaker, poet, quintessential bluesman reinvents himself and propagates utterance, resisting the hold, the ocean's lure, the lash, mask, collar, and shackles, resisting grief, the noose and tar, deprivation and invasion, furnish and settle, promises and treachery, resisting to articulate a truth the body knows and struggles without resolution to name something gone. In so doing, the speaker, spokesman, reinvents the collective black body, ushering the community into active questioning and agency, and in propagating utterance, enacts its sounding. So I'm going to, all right. Now, as I mentioned in my general introduction to Sterling Plump's poetry and some of the more specific comments regarding Mafua's song, the majority of his poetry makes its way to the public through print media. Following the conventional pathways of academia, the primary means by which my colleagues and I are endeavoring to share his poetry and our scholarship on his poetry is through print. Even conference papers and talks like this one try to make their way into print in peer-edited journals and nonfiction collections. Yet, as parties to the inheritance of the blues-jazz continuum and advocates of critical embodiment, we should also interrogate our reliance upon the predominance of print. Now, while print technology and the mass production of books have democratized access to black expressive arts, writings, and writings about the blues continuum, print media's potential function as a gateway to an infinite imaginary and low-cost accessibility are perhaps matched by its limiting oppressive force. Notably, theorist Terry Eagleton cautions in his provocative discussion of the origins of literature, print media as a disembodied form, a form that privileges the symbolic as opposed to the material, can be and has been used to colonize and placate readers. With the rhetoric of mental freedom, readers can be encouraged to find the solace in books that is absent from hostile material conditions of their lives, and further, to accept that solace as a substitute for concrete change. And I'm just going to mention a little bit about the mirror neuron system and then wrap up. So of particular interest then is the new knowledge that I mentioned earlier regarding the role of mirror neuron systems, agentic function, and affect that indicates insights regarding humans' processing of still and moving image and spoken language. Neuroscientists' recent findings show that observing an action being done by another person provokes the same mirror neuron system response in the subject as does imagining doing the action herself. Findings also demonstrate that the subject's mirror neuron system responds similarly when processing spoken language regarding that action. In effect, we rehearse or imitate every action we witness, and we experience speech that renders action as witnessed action. These insights extend to how we understand the meanings of spoken language and the actions we witness, as well as our comprehension of other people's emotions and intentions. I believe that these insights support various scholars' assertions regarding the significance of embodiment and the intimacy and connection engendered by performance. Similarly, I think they offer a biological dynamic supporting scholars' foregrounding of performance as a way of knowing. In addition, they indicate a correlating component in the consideration of the value of utterance or spoken language, especially regarding its performative force or its capacity to enact that which it speaks. By implication, then, through performance, poetry has the capacity to deliver realms of complex, nuanced meaning, otherwise inaccessible in print. So, I'm going to end here. So drawing from my interest in cognitive neuroscience and my analytical engagement with blues jazz continuum as a poet and performer, I've come to recognize then the value of the performance studies model of text performance hybridity for the presentation of my scholarship on Sterling Plumb. And I've also really begun to understand kind of what has been happening with me in my body as I've gone through a kind of sounding of his work in order to do my composition of my scholarship, and also my inclination as a poet and performer to transform some of his work into performance pieces. So part of what's going to be featured on Saturday will be a performance piece that uses some repurposed text from Sterling Plump's Mafua song that really kind of came about through my sounding of the text and it kind of entering into my body as a kind of way of knowing, and then positioning me to actually feel even a bit more liberated. And I think part of what has happened to me, particularly in the writing of this talk, has been a kind of resistance even of that embodied way of knowing, in part because of my position as an academic, thinking about how important text is, and then kind of really further subjugating that kind of embodied knowledge myself as such a well-trained academic. So I've kind of done a serious kind of push and pull, but I finally arrived at a place where these things have been more integrated for myself. And I'm hoping as well that in the reading of things aloud and the sounding for you, that you've also been able to experience some of its performative force. And I want to thank you very much for your attention this evening.
Wireless mic, thank you. That was marvelous. The wireless mic, yes. Great.
For those who cannot make it on Saturday, is it impossible to give just a small sample of what is going to be performed?
Can I
Conversation?
Let's see. Well, I won't do Sterling Plumb since we've talked about him so much. I'll do one of my sound pieces. Let's see. I didn't bring any. Okay. Black hand side. Black flag. Roach spray. Blackjack game. Blackstrap molasses and or stain. Black hat, ride, gripsack, smack on a natty back track. Black hat, ride, gripsack, smack on a natty back track. Scrap, data flat, spat, whack, scratch, map, task, apparatus, axe. Spastic, graphic, wrist to static, spastic, graphic, grapple, grasp, addict. Slingshot, pragmatic, slicker, lather, grizzly, addict, value, added, package. See also black hag, black hole, blackened halibut.
Well, I'll ask a question while you think of one. Thank you again, and
Thank
you
you.
for that preview of coming attractions. My question actually is a little associated with this, the dialectics that are inherent in what you've talked about, the oral and the written, theory and practice, which you are embodying yourself, the fact that you'll be here and then you'll be there on Saturday. Maybe you want to go here, maybe you don't, or maybe it will provoke something else, but I can't help but think that you're from Chicago, and Jeremiah Wright is from Chicago, and Obama is from Chicago, and we have, in Jeremiah Wright, the embodiment, it would seem, of otherness, whereas Obama is, essentially, proposing a post-racial America. And since you're here under the auspices, among other things, of American studies in addition to creative writing in English, I wonder if you'd like to address, because certainly having seen Obama as a candidate a year before he was elected, extemporaneously speaking in Washington Square, I went, wow, what an unbelievable performance. And obviously, Jeremiah Wright was one of those clear sources, and it was there was clearly a sort of Oedipal relationship that was sort of cut off for political reasons. So I don't know whether that, is provocative, useful in any way, or you want to even go there, but it came up, and
Well, let's see, what should I say? I don't know. I mean, being from Chicago, I'm privy to quite a bit more than I think and being a black woman from Chicago of a particular age, and also being a member, having grown up in the United Church of Christ, and my Mission Council 7, also included Trinity United Church of Christ, of which Jeremiah Wright is the pastor. And my brother went to high school with one of his daughters, and so I've been in close contact with Reverend Wright and known of him and have spoken to him and etc. It's really interesting. He's definitely quite a performer, and I think that anybody who had the opportunity to actually view the entirety of his presentation would be able to recognize that he was not calling for the destruction of the United States of America in his sermon, but instead in the tradition of African American sermons and in the tradition of the Black church, he was calling for an accounting. And it's unfortunate, however, that the ways in which things are kind of taken out of context and read without any real degree of a kind of critical lens, that information wasn't kind of brought to the fore. I mean, he had a real advocate in Father Flager, who's a Catholic priest in the city, who refused to position Jeremiah Wright in this kind of space of that kind of demonized radical otherness. But it is really another tradition, and because so many people don't, the majority of Americans don't have access to it, don't quite understand it. They, as scholars have said, actually I was referring to Nietzsche, it said, you can deem evil that which you do not understand, that which seems to be kind of challenging in that way. And of course, Barack Obama, as a politician, had to take certain steps in order to placate those who would stand in his way of achieving his ultimate goal. And that's, so that's what I would say about that. But, when thinking about the kind of, thinking about the politics of performance, it is very interesting, the way in which the sermonic tradition, you can use these elements or strategies, in different ways for different ends, right? So simply because something has its basis in a blues jazz continuum, or in something that is radical and interested in position for social justice, does not mean that it cannot be co-opted and used in some other kind of realm to further a different kind of discourse. Though I'm going to speak with the audacity of hope and say that perhaps, all is not lost with that move, right? So that perhaps this choice that Barack Obama did make, as a politician, will ultimately yield something towards social justice, and then in some way kind of be in line with the work of Jeremiah Wright. in not only calling for an accounting, but actually having an accounting and moving us forward with some kind of progress. Hope.
Hope deferred, make it
Faith.
March.
Maybe faith even. Maybe it's not hope. Maybe it's faith.
So maybe, so it sounds to
Wait
me
for the
like-
mic.
So to return to Dr. Myers' question, so it sounds to me that the assessment that many are making in the mainstream media of some sort of post-racial America, in fact, is wishful thinking. How would you assess this? Are we in a post-racial America in any significant way?
Well, right now we're in Lebanon.
It's not a post-racial.
Okay. Right, okay. I've only been here for a little bit, but I'm pretty sure that's right. I think for the purposes of dominant discourse, yes, we are in a post-racial America. It makes it much more difficult then to address ideology, oppressive structures. It makes it, I think we've moved into that arena in our way in the rhetoric, in part in order to ensure the health and well-being of the status quo, I think, unfortunately. So I do, however, have to say that I do believe that young people in the United States of America, my students included, have a very different experience of race, right, and ethnicity than people had, even 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and certainly any child who was 5 years old when you had a black man running for president of the United States and then winning not only the nomination, but then winning and becoming president of the United States, it looks different, and that is something else to be interpreted, interrogated, and will contribute to people's sense of race. But I'm not sure that it's possible to move outside of race in the United States of America, considering its history, and it's not even, it's not that old of a country. So I think it would probably take a long time. And part of the analysis that I would bring to it has so much to do with the ways in which, particularly, the legacy of slavery is is pronounced through the body, and that's also part of the reason why it makes it so difficult to move beyond, because it is the body that is being read, and not and the body. And I don't even want to go into what I could imagine would need to happen, although some people are kind of doing this now, like interested in miscegenation and the attempt to then change the way in which the bodies in the United States of America look, so that the bodies will no longer kind of be read in that way. Long-winded answer to your question.
Well, I know this is going to be quite generalizing, because it's more connected to the Afro-American culture as a whole. So it's not completely combined to your subject, but as you are Afro-American and an academic in the subject, you are definitely more an expert on the subject than I am. Neither Afro nor American. But every time I discuss Afro-American culture with someone who does not know about the subject, they really often, whether it's on music, jazz, blues, hip-hop, or literature, or the politics, or the social issues, they always say that Afro-American culture And they don't say this for racial issues, obviously, but they say that their impression is that Afro-American culture is not developing, it's not inventive, it's always being back, it's always connected to memory, loss of something, talk about what was, not what is, or what is can be, or what is gonna be. Is this true in any sense? Do you agree on this? I mean, is it in the Afro-American cultural identity more to look backwards? I mean, also in these lyrics you gave us, it's more about talking about loss and memory rather than being, I mean, yeah. Am I right or wrong?
Well, I don't think that African American culture and expressive arts are not forward moving. I do think that there is a legacy and a kind of a burden. Sometimes it looks like can feel like a rather large burden of a past, of a traumatic past that has not been, if we use kind of the language of trauma studies, in some way has not been integrated. And so if you have this unintegrated excess, traumatic excess, it needs to be kind of worked through in order to get to a point where you would not have, well, actually, you only dissolve trauma in a sea of resources, so it's not as if the idea is to wish away that kind of information, because, I mean, and I guess I have a kind of classical analysis of things. When we do that wishing away, that's when we position ourselves to just recreate the same kinds of happenings historically with one another or against one another, to one another, what have you. So, no, I think that that's not really the case, and I think that for a lot of people, actually, you know, when you're looking at, say, for example, blues, right? That the blues epistemology for those whom that's their kind of primary way of knowing, a lot of people are still in the position of being significantly disenfranchised with not so much access to education. You know, there are places with no, unfortunately, I don't know if it's supposed to be is it the richest country in the world? No, that's a wish. The United States of America, no, I wouldn't say that. But, you know, there are, certainly calling ourselves developed, right? But there are places still in Mississippi, some places, actually I used to live in upstate New York, places where they had dirt floors. In upstate New York, it gets to be 30, 40, 50 degrees below zero, right? So you have people who are the experiences that are kind of described as being the material conditions that work with this kind of blues epistemology. That's what their lives are in the present moment. We're not talking about way back. So in some ways, you know, it is the attempt for those folks to, when they're articulating things in that way, whatever that way might be, for those folks to work with what it is that they have. Now, you know, I don't know, I mean, when I think about jazz and improvisational jazz, and a lot of literature, I just don't even, I can't even really understand the idea of it simply kind of looking backward. I mean, I see people looking toward the past in order to take lessons for a present and for a future. And that's kind of what it is that I see. Yeah, I think it's very reductive. I think it's kind of a reductive kind of reasoning to look at it and think that kind of working with past traumas or past triumphs, right? I mean, we study history as a discipline, right? And that's valuable, right? So past traumas, past triumphs. In literature, it's a way for us to understand what it is to be a human being and how we can grow to be better human beings and perhaps evolve I think, as a species. And so I think that that's kind of what the work is, the best work. Now, of course, you know, everything that's being produced, you know, the culture is not the most interesting, nor, you know, the most progressive, exciting, you know, it's not the most cutting edge. Of course, you're going to have some things that are just not particularly interesting, like lots of pop music in the United States of America. You know, hopefully people will forget about it, you know, at some point, right? So, long-winded, circular answer to your question.
I'm a bit confused about this whole post-racial America thing. I mean, isn't the example of Jeremiah right, like, the shining example of why America is still, like, incredibly obsessed with race? Like, the fact that there was this black preacher who was simply recalling the history of the black people in the United States in a semi-forceful manner, sure, but all these things are pretty factually correct, and here he was in the news, all of a sudden he was saying all these things, and the whole nation freaked out, like, nobody could say, these things cannot be said, these things can absolutely never be said, ever, in, like, mainstream discourse. And then Obama just divorces himself from his longtime friend, like, in a political move, and he hasn't made anything up of it yet in a year of office. I mean, you say, oh, well, you have hope that there's change. I mean, I don't know, I just don't see how that's post-racial. I think that's extremely racial. I think that's, I'm confused by that category. I mean,
I'm confused too, I agree. I agree with you that it's not post-racial. So I don't really have much that I could add to your eloquent kind of re-description of it.
and another question maybe is that, like, or a question more of that, when I said before maybe, is what do you think? I mean, there's a variety of answers that could be made for this, but like, looking, like, when I was growing up, I remember seeing, like, gangsta rap on the news all the time. It was like a huge concern for America, and the parental advisors thing. You know, there was a lot of political performance going on. Like, what do you see as the reason why that has sort of disappeared today in today's rap mainstream rap culture? It seems to me has kind of lost that political, social edge that it used to have.
Well, I didn't quite see gangster rap as having a political social edge. Gangster rap was post the social political commentary. And I guess part of what I would say about the shift in hip-hop and its movement, I mean, it has a lot to do with capitalism and market forces. And so I think when it was born, you know, it had a lot of potential, and it did. People participated in hip-hop culture as a way of issuing kind of radical critique. But then through the principle of co-optation, I think it was either demonized or co-opted in kind of both ends. So what you kind of see was people recognize the music industry, folks, we can make money off of this, right? And there you have it, money being made. And then a lot of the other more progressive, kind of radical kind of politics just fell to the wayside. And in part, I mean, that too has to do with a kind of, you know, who owns the means of production, and, you know, what it is that we're talking about when we say hip hop or we say rap, right? What is popular, like really popular and seen? I mean, you still have lots of people who are making music and who are making work that is socially conscious, that really moves in the same kind of tradition with which hip hop was begun, right? It's just that they don't get airplay. Well, it used to be, say in the 1970s, apparently, although I wasn't alive, I wouldn't know. In the 1970s, you could actually get a record on the radio in the United States of America. You can't do that as some individual person going up to your neighborhood radio station today. You can't get airplay that way. They have a playlist, through Clear Channel. I mean, so there. I think it has a lot to do with the fact that you can make money off of it and the way in which dominant discourse works. So recognizing that it works that way, you have to come up with something else, right? They seize that thing, so you're like, okay, well, there goes that. So you come up with some other something in order to really try to get people thinking, to create spaces for people to think and experience things differently, thinking in the body, having a different embodied experience of the world. So.
I was very interested in your materialist epistemology, or what you call the loser epistemology, and how it repudiates the mind-body dichotomy. And you pointed out how the privileging, or how the mind-body dichotomy and the privileging of the mind over the body serves an ideological function oftentimes, of like getting people to divert their attention from the chains of their bodies and poverty in the world or whatever towards like mental freedom, whatever. But I also wondered about it's counterintuitive to me in the sense that it also seems like this dichotomy could serve sort of like positive purpose for like the person who's being raped or who's being subjected to slavery or whatever, right? Who wants to escape from physical reality in order to survive maybe and make it through this experience. So I'm just wondering how, I tend towards materialist, epistemologies as well, because I think it's important to focus on what's actually happening in material reality, and do agree with you that the privileging of the mind, leads to things like seeking freedom in religion or something like this, and diverting our attention away. But it also seems like, does it serve a positive ideological function in terms of if you're being subjected to something like rape in that moment, to escape from that, and how do you make sense of your embodied knowledge in times like that, or in the years of African slavery? Do you think the epistemology changed, or I don't know if this makes any sense?
Well, I think that even the Surgeon General says that the mind and the body are one. So the Surgeon General of the United States of America. So I don't think that the dichotomy serves a purpose for a victim of some kind of trauma trying to move, dealing with some kind of trauma, say like a rape. You may have that splitting that will happen, but in order for that person who has experienced that trauma to then not be further traumatized and say get to the point of having PTSD, they need to integrate that trauma. Okay, and so if it were, if you look at it with the mind-body dichotomy firmly in place, the person doesn't recognize the degree to which that mind, right, exists throughout the body, and then you have there are chemicals that are produced by the brain, and then there was a medical doctor, for example, the book is called The Body Bears the Burden, and he studied motor vehicle accidents, and he kind of likened our experiences, humans, with trauma to animals' experiences. Say of trauma, say you have an antelope who's being chased by a lion, and the lion is about to eat the antelope. Well, there are certain chemicals, I don't know if they're endorphins, but chemicals that are going to be sent from the brain through the body in order to keep the animal from experiencing the pain that it would experience by being, bitten, chomped on, seized, right, by this attacking predator. Well, say the prey is able to get away. The thing that the prey does after the predator goes is shake. I mean, just shakes and physically removes the toxins from the body, right? So in many ways, we don't, well, at least I guess in Western society, definitely with a WASP kind of society, the idea of breathing and moving the body is kind of, is an right? So you kind of have a way in which we don't allow a kind of very natural process of kind of evacuating toxins from the body after a physical experience or emotional experience. Because an emotional experience of trauma is also physical. Our emotions, there are these chemicals. This is a materialist, neuroscientific kind of way of looking at it. And even if we kind of weren't looking at it in that way, still someone who I mean, part of my entree into looking at trauma studies has to do with my own kind of position relative to trauma as a rape survivor, right? So I completely understand this idea of kind of grappling with this kind of the splitting off or dissociation, right? That happens. But there's a point at which dissociation becomes maladaptive. And the dissociation, I think, can become maladaptive in part because someone is not recognizing that all of this is a part of one something, and that you cannot, with any degree of success, move toward a kind of recovery by I'm not going to say because it's not simply a kind of a cognitive process either. Some of it is beneath the level of consciousness kind of when that happens. But you can see that triggers for that kind of dissociation, they're continuously activated. They can be activated outside of and not in line with proportion to whatever the experience is that the person is having at a present time, such that the trauma is able to continue to rehearse itself in the body / mind of the person. So my long answer, is no. I don't think that the dichotomy and looking at it as a dichotomy, right, is really helpful. I think that it can be a momentary, I guess, salve. You can think of it kind of that way. But I think ultimately it will not help a person move toward recovery to see the self kind of in that way, and instead will keep him or her inside of a kind of cycle, and actually allows the trauma to almost kind of enlarge itself, and to kind of actually almost even take space like within the body, because you're trying to shut off that and denying experiences of the body that might give you some information as to the ways in which you're experiencing trauma and things that you might need to do, in order to keep yourself, oneself safe, and move toward safety and recovery and health.
So thank you all, and thank you, Duriel. We are very grateful. Please try to come on Saturday if you're